And I believe that there's 4 good reasons why the book of Revelation uses symbols and imagery to such good effect. And so I wanted to give those to you real quick. The number one reason I think that Revelation uses symbols and imagery is preservation. You know, symbols truly stand the test of time. When you take, for instance, the cross. You know, the cross for hundreds of years was used as an instrument of execution. It was one of the most painful, excruciating ways to be executed. But then Jesus came along. He was crucified on the cross. He rose again on the 3rd day. And now that cross for the last 2,000 years has forever meant the same thing. It means hope. It means the resurrection. It means Christianity. We know that symbol transcends time. It transcends cultures. It transcends languages. It is a symbol that has stood the test of time. And so symbols and imagery stand the test of time. They can cut through language barriers. They can cut through cultural barriers, all those sort of things. And so preservation, I think, is a really big reason why symbols and imagery are used in the book of Revelation. The second reason is something I would say is emotion. You know, symbols elicit a lot of emotion out of us. You know, for those of us that grew up in the 80s and the 90s and we remember the Cold War and the Soviet Union and all that, if just seeing a picture of a hammer and sickle, for instance, it elicits emotion out of us. Or for that matter, if we see an American flag and we see stars and stripes, that elicits an emotion out of us as well, you know. And so it's patriotic and it's freedom, and so that tends to be the emotion. Or even when somebody flashes the peace symbol, you know, there's an emotion that comes out of that because it's a symbol. And so symbols tend to elicit emotion out of us more than just simply words do. And so in the book of Revelation, when John talks about the Antichrist, he could simply have said, you know, he'll be a dictator or a world leader that's brokering peace. But instead he says it's going to be a beast that comes out of the sea. And so he gives us this imagery, and it elicits a lot of emotion out of us, much more so than just describing maybe who he is. And so that's a good thing. Then the third reason is simply connection, a connection to the greater canon of Scripture. I don't know if you know this, but half the book of Revelation, the imagery is taken from the Old Testament. And so, you know, the best way to interpret Scripture is to use Scripture. And so when, like for instance, the first century church, they would have read this book and they would have probably understood a lot of the imagery because they knew the Old Testament really, really well. And so for us 2,000 years later, it helps if we know the Old Testament because some of the imagery that's used there is taken from, is in Revelation, and we can better understand how it's used in Revelation as well. So there's a connection to the totality of Scripture, and that shows us too that this book belongs in Scripture, and it's telling us of what's coming. And so there's a connection there with the rest of Scripture. And then the last reason I think that the book of Revelation uses so much imagery and symbols is protection. If you remember, the first century church was under heavy, heavy persecution. The Roman government did not like Christianity at all. And so if they had gotten a copy of this book, you know, the symbols and the imagery would not have been as overt or maybe directly threatening them and their existence. And so it was a little bit of protection for the Christians to have this book. And so those that persecuted the Christians might not fully have understood the imagery or what's being said here. Whereas if you just use plain language, it might have been taken as a direct threat or an existential threat to governments. And so there was a little bit of a protection element to using symbols and imagery as well. And so there you go. Those are the 4 reasons why I believe the book of Revelation uses symbols and imageries to good effect. It's preservation, emotion, connection, and protection.